we're going to look here at APA format, and we'll see what questions that we have. So we're working now with APA updated its form. It's now been 2 years. I guess they updated it in 2019 to the 7th edition. And I think I was not always happy when I see new editions of documentation styles, but I actually felt pretty good about APA and how they revised here. But we're going to take a look at we'll go ahead and focus on a couple of ideas. This presentation really focuses on how to format a quotation or paraphrase using a sigma phrase, and then how to format a reference entry for an article in a book. But let's take a look here. What I'm going to do, let's see if this will open up. I'm going to actually pull up a sample paper, and I think I can do this here. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a couple of things with, we're using here the student instructions for a student paper in APA style. And you can see here, there's information about how the title page looks. You've got page number up in the right-hand corner. In the 7th edition, APA does not require a running head for student papers. I would ask your instructor if he or she would like you to do a running head. The running head is simply where you would have at the top, you would have a brief version of the title of your paper in the header, that thing that appears at the top. In this case, in the student version, now you just have to include the page number. We're going to look at I'm going to look at a couple of things here. So you can see what you're going to do. In APA format, you're going to find, basically you have 2 ways you can document. And these are actually, one of the things, I know you had asked about MLA format. There's a lot of similarity with MLA and APA format. They're both what we call in-text citation forms. And what that means is basically the way that it works is sort of the same, where in text, you expect when the writer makes a reference to an outside work, the writer is going to use the author's last name as a key for me to know, okay, I'm going to go to in MLA, it's the works cited, in APA, it's the references page, and look for that name alphabetized. And then I can find the full bibliographic information and be able to access that source. That is actually the same. What's different, there are some differences, and we'll go over that. But in text, you're going to find either you have a parenthetical reference, or you have what they call in this edition a narrative reference. So this opening paragraph has several parenthetical references to some different sources. So you can see here, for example, you can see now guided imagery and progressive muscle relaxation are both cognitive behavioral techniques. Okay. Now, then the writer has cited Yalom and Lech, how to pronounce it, 2005. So we have here, and then later we have another source to White 2000. I'm expecting in both of these cases that the writer has gathered the information from Yalom and Lech or from White. And what I should be able to do is to go to the references page, which is at the end of the document. And I should be able to go alphabetically and find, so here, references page. I should be able to find, near the end, White, and then Yalom and Lech. Okay, so that's basically the same movement there in APA format. Now, what's different? The big things that are different would be in APA format, we're going to focus on last names. rather than in MLA format, MLA is a little bit, MLA is a humanities format. It's really primarily for English majors and for other modern language majors, although it's kind of roughly. Oftentimes, they will use first names, like according, in English, according to Stanley Fish, or according to Elaine Showalter. These are like names in the field. They use, oftentimes they're not useful. In APA format, you just use the last name, according to Fish, according to Showalter. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that, and I think there's a reason for that. I think that APA wants us to focus more on the source itself rather than, the first name can, it's a gender thing, usually. Not always, but usually it's kind of an indicator that, it can indicate some of these gender. The second thing is you notice that you see how there's the year. So in parentheses, we got, White, 2000. And that's a consistent element of APA style, is that when you cite an author's name, we want to put the year. They call it an author date style because you've got the author and you've got the year. And that can be really handy for a reader. Why? Because, well, think about it. Let's take this source here, White 2000. Well, that one piece of information, the date, tells me a whole lot. And again, which is a little different than in it. So, for example, in MLA style, let's say I'm citing, William Blake. Well, is it important that he wrote, his The Tiger in 1799? Exactly. Maybe, but not necessarily, or as important that Aristotle wrote in 327 BCE. Maybe. In the sciences and social sciences, which is what you're using typically APA for, it is important because we know, for example, that if White wrote in 2000, we know that that source is 20 years old. It's actually probably a little more because typically people do their research a year or two before, a year or two before they're published. So we know that everything that's been written in the last 2 decades or more is not included in that source because it couldn't, and there's a sense usually in fields that in the sciences and social science that they're building on previous research. So that's really important there. Now, we'll see an example of a this example is really focused on those parenthetical. I like that. Did you see one there?
Yeah, there was one.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Lang here at the bottom of this page, Lang 1982 underscore. So that's what we would call a narrative phrase where we have the author's name, but again, notice that you have the author, Lang, and then in parentheses, 1982. So if it's all in parentheses, you put the author's name and then comma and the year. If it's in the narrative format, you put the author's name, but then right after it, you put in parentheses the year. Okay. So, yeah. Now, by the way, just a word about that. I forget if I cover that elsewhere, but you have in APA format, you handle authors. One of the things you're going to find also in the humanities, things tend to be, it's not exclusively, but they tend to be single author works. And in the sciences and social sciences, it's not like that. In fact, typically, it's 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 6 or 10. Sometimes in the sciences, I have seen, I've heard of articles written by thousands. There are these astronomical things where people are viewing things all over the world with their telescopes and they all report. But the rule in APA goes like this. If you have one author, it's going to be like that, U 2007. Now, if it's 2 authors, you include, McGeegan and Lehrer. You include the 2 authors. If it's 3 or more, you're going to do this. You include the first author plus et al. So 1 author or 2 authors, you always include the 1 or the 2 authors. But if you have more than 2 authors, you just use that first and then et al. Period, just like you see there. Now, just another thing before we'll go back to my PowerPoint here, but just another thing, we'll look at the references. Just like in MLA, the references start a new page for the references. And usually you can do that by just adding, the easiest thing to do is add a page. If you know how to, in Google Docs, add a page break at the end of your conclusion. That'll mean as you're working on it, the references will start on a new page. But just a couple of things here you're going to see. The references, and this is, again, the overall format is really just like MLA, which is we use what's called a hanging indent. And so what does that mean? You can see here, rather than the normal indent we expect is 5 spaces for the first line, and then everything else is flush left. With the hanging indent, we do the opposite. The first line is flush left for each entry, but then everything else for that entry is indented 5 spaces. And you can see, if you look at the example here, you can see why they do that. Remember, we're trying to, the whole point of this is that it's alphabetized. And so by using the hanging indent, you can see how the last name there of the author, which is what's really important, kind of jumps out. You know, Bernstein, Bottomley, Cohen, and so forth. So it makes it easy for the reader to find. And then I'll look at the order of these things for a couple of examples here, but you can see they do. And one of the things APA now encourages us, if we do have a URL address, that we make it a hyperlink. Okay, so I did my sample paper. Okay. So here's an example. So again, an overview. So again, it's in-text citation, just like MLA. Yanofsky, 2003 reported, quote. Now, I have a quotation here. Typically, when you're writing in APA style, you'll notice that there's not a lot of quotation. Typically, in the sciences and social sciences, your focus is more on the findings of work rather than the actual words. And you think about that. See, I think a lot of students, you come from high school, you're probably writing most of your essays for English class and then probably history class. Well, in both of those kind of disciplines, your focus, like when I mentioned William Blake, well, do I care about his ideas? Well, yes, but I really care about how he expressed it. He's a poet, so the words he uses are very important. And when I analyze him, I'm analyzing his words. History is sort of the same way. A lot of what we do is we analyze the exact words of historical documents, letters or essays and so forth, to determine meaning. Now, in the sciences and social sciences, we're typically focused more on, actually, a lot of times we read the articles, they're kind of dull in themselves, but the findings might be interesting, and that's what we want to focus on. So there's a lot more paraphrase. Okay? So here, Yanofsky. Okay. Again, but just because you're putting it in your own words, it still needs to be cited, and that's important. So in other words, you're going to be doing a lot more summary and paraphrase of outside sources, but you document it just almost exactly like you would a quotation, except you're not having a quotation. So you see here, Bauman in 1980 insisted that the subjects should have been completely informed of the possible effects on them. And that's a narrative citation of Bauman 1968, but I could put it into a parenthetical citation, Bauman 1968. Quotation again, really almost the same. See, it's not that different. But now we're putting in again, sometimes you might include just a word or phrase, in this case without question. And that's okay. In other words, sometimes you can mix, sometimes you give a straight quotation, sometimes you do straight paraphrase or summary. Sometimes you can, maybe if you find a word or phrase in the original that you really like, you can quote that and then surround it by your own words. Some sample signal phrases there. And the words are that so-and-so noted, and raw. I'm just going to go quickly through a couple of things about creating a citation. Now, typically in APA format, there's all kinds of things that you can cite. Typically, what you're going to be doing is citing a journal article, because that's in the sciences and social sciences, that's where most of the current research is happening, is in journal articles. You can see here, and we see here the author, and you see it's using that hanging indent format. It's using author, last name, comma, first initials. We don't use the full name, so it's not John M. J.M. period, and then we include the year. So again, this focus on the year happens in text with MLA, which is different from, or in APA, which is different from MLA. And it's also in the references, it's the same way. You put author and then year. And then we have the title, in this case, power through appointment. Notice that the capitalization is a little, it might seem a little funny there. For titles of articles and of books, we capitalize the first letter and then everything else is lowercase. With a few exceptions. If you have a colon, it's a lot of articles have colons because they like, various reasons. Capitalize the letter after the colon, and then if you had a proper noun like Abraham Lincoln, say, you would capitalize the A and the L. Okay? Then we have, but no quotation marks, which is again different from MLA. We see then we have the year, or we have the title of the journal in italics, the title of the, then we have the volume and issue, which is sometimes called the number. And then the page numbers, I'm going to go quickly here. Then we have the DOI. And this is, and you can see they have the DOI listed as a URL address, but the DOI is sort of like a permanent link to that source. It's called a digital object identifier. And if they have, the article has it, which typically is articles in the sciences and social sciences now typically have that, you include that at the end. If you don't have it, you don't really need to include a URL address. It's a little, APA really wants you to focus on the DOI. If you don't have it, basically you don't have it. So again, feel free to reach out to Writing Center and also to the library. The reference librarians are happy to help you with documentation. We're happy to talk with you about that in the Writing Center as well. But I hope that this is useful for people.